In 100-mile ultramarathons, you know pain. There's plenty of muscle pain in events like that. But even in the longer distances, when you are experiencing a lot of pain, that's not necessarily the limiter. And Prefontaine, he never ran a race over 10,000 meters. He suffered plenty, but was it pain, what we would actually describe as perceptually pain by its true definition? Not so much. So pain is not the essence of what makes running hard. So what else might it be? How about fatigue? Fatigue is kind of the enemy. If you're really running to your limit in any kind of race, you're going to experience a lot of fatigue, right? But think about this. When you're running a race and you start to get toward the later stages of it and you're experiencing fatigue, what happens when you stop? Do you feel better right away? You do. No, you do. That's why you stop. You feel a lot better right away. I mean, think about it. I ran a marathon 8 days ago. It was one of the, it's the same every time. The last 5 miles, there's no one who's never run a marathon knows what can't wait till it's over feels like. That you redefine can't wait till it's over. I had it down to the second. I knew when it was going to be over, but it had to happen. As soon as I stopped, yeah, I was wrecked, but I felt a lot better right away. Well, was I any less fatigued? No. Obviously, I didn't recover in 1 second. So fatigue is there, we're experiencing it, but again, fatigue is not the essence of what makes running hard. So what is it? Well, recent advances in neuroscience, where we're able to kind of crank open the lid here and look inside our brains and see what's going on, have revealed that it's actually something called a perception of effort. Now, fatigue is real, pain is real, they're parts of running, but the essence of what makes running hard is a perception that's simply known as perception of effort. And this can be distinguished from the other things that we experience during races, during hard workouts, that make running challenging, but are not the essence of why the sport is hard. So what is perception of effort? It is really, well, I can tell you actually what the guy who defined it as. His name is, it's a researcher I've gotten to know, and he's actually discussed in here a little bit. He does really cool, mind-blowing studies. He's the guy who enhance the exercise performance of people by having them play video games and not exercising. If you want proof of the power of the brain, that is something that has happened. I don't know if you knew. People have increased their endurance performance by playing video games in a chair. So his name is Samuele Marcora. He's Italian, as his name suggests. He told me that actually they don't have exercise physiologists in Italy, so you have to leave. He works in England, but he defines perception of effort as, quote, the conscious sensation of how hard, heavy, and strenuous the task is. Perception of effort is kind of a global sense of how close to your limit you are, how hard you are working now. And we're all capable of teasing this perception apart from things like pain and fatigue. To wrap your head around it a little bit, imagine 2 different circumstances where you're pushing yourself. One is you go outside, find a steep hill. I didn't see many around here, but where I'm from, we have these things we call. So you find a hill, preferably you warm up, and you sprint up it all out. And if you do an absolute all-out sprint up a steep hill, you feel something right away, right? It's like, I'm working very hard right now. I've taken 3 strides and I'm pretty close to my limit. Now take a completely different circumstance. Maybe the last mile of a marathon, which is fresh in my memory. I'm probably going to keep going back to that one, just 8 days ago. Last mile of a marathon. There's so much that's different about that experience than about the uphill all-out sprint, right? You're going a lot slower. In the uphill sprint, your muscles are straining, but they're not hurting. In the marathon, your muscles are hurting, but not necessarily straining. So there are many differences, but there's one thing that's pretty much exactly the same perceptually about those 2 very different ways of pushing up against the limit, and that's perception of effort. That's that sense of my limit is here, and here's my nose, and I'm right there. So you can kind of tease it apart. You could also do this. You could imagine you're running a race, and all your other perceptions are numbed. So your sense of thirst is taken away. Your sense of fatigue is taken away. Your sense of pain is numbed as well. If you took all those things away, there would be something left Perception of effort it's not localized anywhere in the body, but it's also everywhere in the body at the same time. It's almost a sense of you have a will to push your body to do more than it can do. When you're up against the limit of your perception of effort, you're telling your body to do as much as it can, and you're feeling a resistance coming back from it. It's kind of everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Perception of effort. So that's what it is experientially. What is perception of effort physiologically? This is the cool stuff where we've kind of opened this up and can kind of see what this actually is now, perception of effort. The kind of conventional wisdom previously was that, okay, this global sense of how hard I am working is feedback from my body coming to my brain, and then my brain kind of puts it all together, and that's my perception of effort. And we know full well that our brain is receiving sensory feedback from our body. You wouldn't know where to put your foot, each time you take a stride if that weren't happening. So we know it happens. However, we've also learned that that's actually not the source of perception of effort. It is not feedback from your body to your brain. And my favorite way of making the point, incontrovertibly, is that, I don't know if you know this has happened, probably, it made the news, but it is now possible for quadriplegics to control robotic arms with their thoughts. Anyone read about this? Plant electrodes in the motor centers of the brain, and with a little training, we've had quadriplegics, people who are fully paralyzed from the neck down, drinking coffee, eating chocolate, and playing video games by manipulating a robotic arm with their thoughts. Guess what happens when they're just learning this and trying to master using the robotic arm? They bonk. They hit the wall. They get a higher and higher level of perceived effort, just like you do when you're running a race, and they quit in exhaustion, and the arm goes boom, and it's not their arm. And there's no feedback to the brain from this piece of metal. So that's pretty good evidence that it's not sensory feedback. In fact, perception of effort is exactly the opposite. Perception of effort is your brain's own sense of how hard it's driving your body to work. And that's why it doesn't matter if it's your body or not. It's work to control a body that's not yours. If this thing is active, is concentrating for a long period of time, you will start to feel that perception of effort, and eventually you'll quit. So let's get a little deeper into this business of perception of effort. I don't want to get too much. I am not a neuroscientist, so I can't get too deep anyway. Who am I fooling? But just a few brain terms I'll throw at you. The motor cortex and the supplementary motor area. Those are two key areas where this perception of effort is believed to reside. It's activity in these parts of the brain, which are associated with control of movement, that make running hard when it is hard. And this guy, Samuel Marcora, that I mentioned earlier, he basically kind of coined the phrase. He did an interesting study that showed how this works, and it also kind of teases apart the difference between fatigue and perception of effort in an interesting way. So what he did is he had a bunch of people come into a lab and lift a weight. He had to take a weight that was just about as much as they could lift. One time, it's like the sprint uphill. It's hard to lift the weight, but you can do it. And he had electrodes attached to their skull so they could read activity in these parts of the brain. Now, as you probably know, anytime you run, you have to actually tell yourself to do it, right? So if you're standing on the starting line and you don't actually make the decision to run when the gun goes off, you'll be left behind. That's where it all begins. It's an act of will. You have to, it's like your brain is the rider and your body's the horse. Your brain has to crack the whip. So it's actually possible to measure this. This is where it all begins. It's called movement-related cortical potential. So it's possible to measure the intensity of this will to make your body run, or how hard your brain is cracking the whip on your body. So when these subjects were lifting a heavy weight that was about as much as they could lift, and measurements of movement-related cortical potential were taken, they were very high. At the same time, the subjects were asked for their subjective ratings of perceived effort, and they were all very high together, all in lockstep, lifting as much as they could, subjectively reporting maximum perceived effort, and this high level of movement-related cortical potential. Okay, Got all that. Second part of the experiment, he had the same subjects take a very light weight and had them lift at one time. Very low movement-related cortical potential, very low ratings of perceived effort. But then he had them keep lifting it. Now it's getting a little bit more like running a marathon versus the maximum heavy lift was more like that sprint uphill. What happens when they kept lifting the weight? The measurements of this will, of the brain's will to crack the whip on the body, go up and up and up. Perceived effort goes up and up and up, and eventually the subjects have to quit. And that's how fatigue plays into making running hard, is that when the fatigue is real, physical fatigue in your body, of course, it happens. When your muscles are tested to the limit, they will tire out. As your muscles and your body become less responsive to the crack of the whip, what does your brain have to do? Crack the whip harder and harder. So fatigue has an indirect effect, primarily an indirect effect on perception of effort. As your body becomes less responsive to your brain's will to keep moving, your brain has to work harder and harder. The harder your brain works, the harder your running effort feels. So great, a lot of science. Why does this matter? The real question to ask is, as runners ourselves, some of us as coaches, we're all about, okay, getting better, performing better. The way to form this question is, are there circumstances in which our tolerance for perceived effort, our limits on that tolerance, are actually limiting our performance versus our physical limits? Are there situations where we tend to think of, I couldn't run any faster in the race because my body reached its absolute limit and it couldn't do any more? Well, is it possible that actually that sometimes doesn't happen, and you actually don't run any faster than you do in the race because you couldn't take any more up here? That simply the perception was too much. The suffering was too intense, and you sort of voluntarily didn't run faster, when perhaps physically there was a little bit left in reserve. Well, it turns out that actually always happens. This is bad news for runners. We do not like hearing this. You guys are getting ready to burn me in effigy. You think, okay, maybe you don't reach your physical limit, but I do. But it's absolutely not true. And it's actually very easy to prove, and it's been proven in a variety of ways. So under no circumstance does any runner ever encounter their absolute physical limits in a race. And I'm talking about garden variety fatigue, hitting the wall, bonking, not you have an aneurysm or a heat stroke. All right, that's different. But you don't, like on a purely, aside from medical emergencies, you actually never reach your physical limits. It's always perception of effort. You reach the tolerance for what you can take experientially. You just can't take any more suffering. And that's what limits our performance. We tend to think of perceptions as intangible.